Perhaps the two most common tests of religious faith are difficulties endured when God's help might feel as though far away, or some form of fear of obscurity, whether subtle or not so subtle, not trusting that by God's grace that there might be deeper significances to ordinary life, even if it comes without worldly acclaim. Focusing on the second of these tests of faith in its less subtle forms, history is littered with accounts of mighty tyrants and self-aggrandizing lesser figures and of their monuments to their own glory, seeking in such structures an everlasting acclaim in case of any risk of obscurity. But in its more subtle forms, perhaps, maybe, whatever jockeying for power, seeking undue attention we might indulge in or be tempted towards, might have at least some root in the same basic fear of obscurity. In these relatively minor cases, the same underlying fear can lead so easily to envy and dissension, moving our attention towards lesser goods in ways that lose sight of what our faith tells us matters infinitely more. There is, I suppose, a real test of faith in what we prioritize and allow ourselves to care about most. In the Gospel reading for today's beautiful feast of the Visitation, a then obscure woman makes her way to an unnamed place in the hill country of Judea, to an older woman, a then pretty obscure person too. This happened in what was a dark and dull time for the people of Israel, the days of Herod, yet another tyrant given to casual cruelty and yet more monuments to himself. This was an obscure time, not illumined, or so it seemed, by the prophets of Israel. The age of the prophets seemed long over, an age that reached back as far as Moses and Aaron, prophesying about the promised land. This central plank and this distinctive and enlivening feature of the identity of Israel as God's chosen people seemed a very distant memory, for the last great prophet of Israel was Malachi several centuries before. But it was precisely in what was an obscure setting that the prophets returned to Israel. John the Baptist, so much a prophet that he leapt in the womb at the presence of the unborn Christ, so much a prophet that he prophesied even before he was born. And Elizabeth too, she shared in this prophesying, for her words declared mighty truths of great import, that Mary was with child, a child that has been specially chosen by God. And Elizabeth's words imply this special child has a role even greater than that of her son John. Indeed, Elizabeth speaks of Mary as mother of my Lord, even if Elizabeth does not appreciate the full significance of her words, which is surely typical of the prophets of Israel, you might say. Her use of Lord, a title used elsewhere of God in the Gospel of Luke, prepares us from the outset to recognize in Christ the fullness of divinity. So this great moment within the history of Israel took place not with great acclaim or the glare of human attention, no, quite the contrary. It took place in utter obscurity, in an unnamed place, and involving only women deemed of lesser value than men in those days, and unborn babies no less. God can work in and through obscurity and raise up what is obscure within the drama of salvation. And Mary's great song of triumph, echoing the words of Hannah at the birth of Samuel many centuries before, implicitly situate this wonderful event within the long history of Israel, reminding us that in all the intervening times in which, for the most part, relatively little of note seemed to be happening, the people of Israel were not forgotten. God was indeed present in the seemingly inconsequential events of their lives, in the lives of men and women, the bulk of whom are now lost to history, utterly obscure to us, but known eternally to God. And these obscure lives kept the people of Israel going, and will thus lead in time to the coming of Christ, and after that to the church, and including in that you and me, participating in this Mass here at Blackfriars right now. God can indeed work in and through obscurity and raise up what is obscure within the drama of salvation. And today's feast reminds us it can be in seemingly obscure places and among seemingly obscure people that so much of the wonder of salvation unfolds.